Rather a peculiar title, but hopefully, well, we can expand on that to explain.
Yep.
Yeah.
We're expanding.
So what do we mean by this? Well, coming from a psychological perspective, it's more parsimonious, it's simpler if we've got one general perceptual mechanism that can perceive objects, and recognise the visual characteristics of objects and recognise characters. But maybe as typographers, type designers, we'd like to think that we have some specialised mechanisms for recognising characters. But it's not a new debate, and it's been around in the psychological research for a while. It's been applied to speech processing, but as you can hopefully see from the left-hand paper, it's actually been found that speech processing is not special, again, because people come back to this time and time again. And also with faces, where there's a debate on face processing. But let's show you what we mean by face processing. This is an illusion from Peter Thompson in 1980, where you need to consider the orientation or the spatial relationships of features. So if we are to invert that, if we were to invert it, then you'll see that Maggie Thatcher, well, the right one is on her right face is on the left-hand side there. So we weren't able so we weren't really able to detect those, the messing around the features, because we ordinarily see faces in the upright orientations. Now with objects, it's also more difficult to see the relationship between features when objects are upside down, but it's particularly difficult with faces, and that's called the inversion effect. The guy who, right, yeah, no, I'll be quick, but I want to add this in. The guy who came up with this, it was for his PhD. He never explained what the illusion was, because I don't think he knew what it was. It was at the end of his PhD. But what he said, subsequently commenting on it, was that it was probably the best thing Margaret Thatcher, ever did for science. And over to David.
Right. So this discussion was brought to my attention kind of through this paper, which used machine learning models trained on object recognition, and then apply those models to recognize characters, which has a few problems there. I think, yeah, I'll just go there and say, what is the alternative here? Like, what are the non-objects? And second one is we are using, or they are using machine learning, the neural networks as a model of how humans actually function. And even if you prove that the machine learning, therefore, if you prove the machine learning model can do this, that does not mean that humans do it the same way.
So why are we pursuing this debate, given that in other speech processing is not being found to be special, and that the example that David's just described suggests that there's nothing special? Well, we've seen there's the interest from vision and computer science. There's, we hope, practical implications for educators in terms of literacy acquisition, and for typographers, a few things from a practical and a theoretical perspective. But I think what we're going to try and do here with just a few themes or musings or ideas is to talk about the complexity of character recognition and how we think that the object recognition mechanisms might be modified in order to recognize characters. And this isn't a new thing that we, the next slide, I think.
Is that you or me?
Is that?
Ah, yes.
Yeah. So we're not actually presuming, our premise is not that there are two separate systems, but it's based on the neuronal recycling hypothesis, which is that we modify our general mechanisms, and when we learn to read. So there aren't two sort of separate things. So we're hoping to show a bit about what that modification might be and why. I think it's you.
Right. So I have just a few notes from a type design / researcher perspective. First, we need to set the stage on the current consensus of how reading works. Martin already showed a little bit about that. Essentially, the consensus is that we read characters in parallel. These feed into word detectors. Basically, we create word candidates, and then from these we choose what's most likely in the given linguistic context. But here in this talk, we'll be interested in basically this part. So that's what I would call character recognition, which roughly maps on graphing to graph correspondence. So we are staying on the material side of things. I think what would be called graphetics in grapholinguistics. And the line is squiggly because it's not always clear what's going on there. In visual communication, we use slightly different, each field has their own nomenclature. Each nomenclature has its own considerations, and therefore it misses considerations of other fields. So we choose to stick with the language of visual communication, sort of adapted to work within psychology. So we would use the term character in a nice, like, fluid, flexible way, which allows us to sort of tweak from general to specific, and specific is the most material character image, which when perceived becomes a character shape. And interestingly, Palmer has this really nice illustration for this. The same character image / shape can function as two different characters. We are able to read this because the top-down processes from basically the context, linguistic context, help us to read this and figure out what is it that we are looking at. Another interesting thing about characters is we are able to identify them in all sorts of visual conditions. So scale, position, negative color, background situation, rotation, and even to some extent skew. We are invariant, or our perception of that particular shape is invariant to those transformations.
So a psychologist would call this probably perceptual constancy, which is that we respond in a more constant way to all these variations, the variants. And size constancy just chosen here because it's a, I think, quite convincing demonstration. So she has physically remained the same size, but because you know that she should be in the distance, you've adjusted her size. So that's size constancy, but we're going to look at other forms of constancy.
So here we have a funny
but we can't.
Thing. No, we don't have to tell.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, one last time. These are small, but the ones out there are far away. Small, far away.
I think that just demonstrates we need to learn from our experience with the world. We have to learn to constant. And Dougal didn't manage it. And apologies to the Irish.
High quality TV programming. So here is another interesting thing. We are able to recognize characters even though they take all sorts of different, let's call them styles or different forms. This is an example from Douglas Hofstetter and Gary McGraw. And yes, that's the same Douglas Hofstetter that was critiquing Donald Knuth yesterday, or that was in the question. So interestingly, we can recognize characters like vastly different, and that's a bit the big question in AI. What I'm personally interested in is the visual coherence in fonts. So that's sort of, you could metaphorically say it's orthogonal problem, that even though the characters have different linguistic identities, they have a shared trait, what you could call a visual style or visual coherence. And this is very much what type designers do. And in fact, we all do it in some way through tools and even in handwriting. And that can be actually leveraged in some way in reading.
So that, yes, we can capitalize on that coherence. I think this was just mentioned in a talk, and something that's called the font regularity effect or font tuning. And this was discovered by a psychologist, Tom Sanoki, the late 1980s, finding that we can process letters more quickly if they have this coherence or uniformity. So both distinctiveness, which tends to be emphasized, to have differences between characters is important, but so is this sort of uniformity.
Sure.
Yeah. So hopefully you found the first one a bit more difficult to read, but we'll have another demo a bit later. So some subsequent studies, well, the left one uses the very crude technology that Tom Sanoki had in 1988. And the experiments are very often using, well, not using words, might be single characters and varying the fonts, the visual characteristics, and coming up with this result that if you don't mix, then you're better able to process more quickly. Sophie Bayer, who's thankfully being introduced already, as a type designer, and I looked at this from more a practice-based perspective, looking at whether bold or italic might be better for emphasis. In other words, how much does it slow you down? And we can give you a quick demo of this. We used what's called rapid serial visual presentation, where you see a series of words. And so just to show what that would look like, your task will be, that was to warm you up, your task will be, is there a non-word in the next sequence? Too fast. We have to comply. Okay.
I think there was, I would say yes.
Yeah, I don't know what actually, but have another go.
Does the line count as a non-word?
That's where you fill your answer.
I hope that wasn't terribly convincing, but what we did was to adjust the speed for each person. So actually it was a manageable task, which we obviously can't do in here. So perhaps this room is a bit slower, you know. Help. Font tuning has also been, just to say, has been looked at in Chinese and found that it does occur with Chinese characters. But perhaps more interesting, I think, is that you do need to be able to read Chinese in order to be able to tune. So if they are random shapes, if you don't read Chinese, then you can't actually tune into the irrelevant, task irrelevant characteristics. So it does suggest, as Gautier et al. Said, characters are not processed in the same manner as shapes. Maybe though objects, we do tune to the stylistic characteristics, the stylistic regularity. And Peter Walker, in doing an overview of font tuning, ended by saying, well, maybe it happens with cutlery, so that maybe we can more easily pick out a fork when it's amongst the same style of forks. We don't know, so there's an experiment to do. That was really looking at more character by character or non-words, but not in the context of reading. And that has been explored by looking at more beyond the character or word recognition. And as David explained, what we know of reading from psychological models is that we go from the letter in various variants. We strip that out, we have an abstract letter identity, and then form a word. Now, this looked at the consistency between the stylistic characteristics of the word and the meaning of the word. So perhaps if we go on to the next one. And it does seem, though, there is some sort of top-down interaction going on. So we don't forget about what the stylistic characteristics were once we recognise the characters and the word, but perhaps we somehow hang on. I don't know why I'm doing this. This is a top-down thing, I suppose. And what they did was to make the meaning of the word consistent or inconsistent with the characteristics. So the participants were asked, is this a fast or a slow animal, or is this a light or a heavy animal? And you might recognise this sort of paradigm from the Stroop effect, which Terry introduced yesterday. What the Lewis and Walker work is a reverse Stroop, because you're not asked to say that what the typeface is. Thankfully, you are asked to go for the meaning of it, whereas here you're asked for the colour. And something else, that looking at whether we remember the character style, is from this paper. And I particularly like this quote because typography is described as the superficial perceptual details, and yet, oh, that didn't get a laugh. And yet we do retain that information. This was done with eye movement recording, because if we, and they did it a week later, if we read in a very distorted font, it needs to be very distorted to work, and we read a different sentence a week later in an experiment setting, then we're actually fixate for a shorter time if it's in the same font than a different one, which seems to me astonishing as to why we would hold on to this rather old information.
This came up when we were doing a follow-up study on the effects of disfluency, meaning when you're reading a difficult typeface, you're able to retain more information. However, the results were inconclusive, so if you want to read about that, we can do it on designregression.com. It will come up later.
This was just mentioned just now, yeah. We talked about invariance and the importance of invariance, so recognizing different forms and forming constancy or invariance. But of course, some characters are mirror images or plane rotations of other characters, and we need to discriminate those when we learn to read.
And of course, the Typographic Guild obligates me to say they are not mirror images. I'll show you the reversed. So that's the D and Q reversed, and you can compare them with the B and P to see that they're actually designed differently. And that's kind of one of the biggest improvements of your typeface, of the Prima presented earlier, that it actually improves and goes against this symmetricity.
Well, they're pretty similar. And a few studies have looked at the age at which this discrimination is learned when learning to read, and I'm sure it matters on as to what the pedagogical approach is, but it seems to be around 7 to 10, or no, it's around 7. It's starting, and certainly at 10, it's absolutely fine. So we can learn it. Apart from Dougal, we can learn it relatively quickly.
Yeah. So because Mary spoke most of the time, I'll do the conclusions. Here we go, like general shapes in one column, characters as specialized shapes in the other column. The way we see it, it seems that size, rotation, position, invariance are shared. invariance to visual style is probably also shared. There is something about unlearned mirror invariance. We didn't say it, did
No,
we?
didn't say it.
It's sort of typical to Latin scripts and maybe a couple of other scripts that have letter characters that are mirrored. But for example, in Tamil, there doesn't seem to be that problem. It's more complicated.
Yeah, there's an interesting paper on Tamil that we won't talk about.
We don't know whether shapes generally capitalize on coherence, but we know for sure that characters do. And we don't know whether there is important iconic secondary semantic information in shapes, but again, in characters, we know there is some. So yeah, that's all from us for today. Questions?
I was wondering, do you know anything about how this relates to grapheme-based synesthesia and whether this the character recognition of objects is related to that?
I don't, because although I'm aware of synesthesia, not that particular example of it. So it'd be good to talk with you about that.
I don't know.
Oh,
Wondering.
oh, right.
I just read it. So.
Yeah, I want to ask like about context. Yeah, sorry. I wanted to ask you about context, like if you research anything further in that sense, because I feel like it's a very important element to how we process letter shapes. But this is just my feeling. Like I don't have evidence for this. But like, for example, any shape that is slightly triangular, if we put it in a all caps word replacing the letter A, that will serve perfectly for us as a letter A, even though it's like super far from typographically traditional shape, you know? Or I don't know, another example, we were talking about rotation and I don't know, 180 degree V will clearly serve as an A rather than a V and stuff like that. I don't know, did you like look into this like context issue more specifically? Any further research? I don't know.
I know there has been done research swapping letters in numbers, numerals instead of letters. So that's sort of along the line of testing for what we are capable of reading. But yes, I think there is observable effect of context, totally, as seen in the cat.
Sorry, I'm also wondering how it relates, especially the thing about remembering fonts long term, how that relates to scripts that are a script that you already know but slightly different. I'm thinking things like medieval paleography that takes people a really long time to learn, and if you don't practice it regularly, you can't read it anymore. And it's still characters, and it's still mostly characters you understand. So why give that?
Something I didn't mention is what has gone with the something being special is that it's overlearned and there's an element of expertise. So I think it probably can't kick in until there's been that length of time or whatever. That might answer it, I'm not sure.
I have a question about the material support. Are you finding it independent of the support, or would it be different on paper, screen, and marble, iron?
I wouldn't expect it to be different, but I'm not aware of a study that would look into that.
So it's always, all studies are abstract. They look at shapes without saying where, how, what form, what support.
a lot of them are on screen, aren't they?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I would say
yes.
most
So
of
you're
them
right,
are on
they are.
screen, different fonts, and that.
They're much more fluid.
Oh, yeah. Is there any research, or did you consider the question of secondary script? I mean, that it's like secondary language acquisition. So whether you learn a script or a writing system in school, you say it's 7 to 10, or is there a difference when you do that for different scripts or so later?
I don't know. And the only thing that the paper that we didn't talk about, which I don't think this really answers your question, so I'm really just, I suppose, sneaking it in, is that readers of Tamil were compared, well, monoliterate, biliterate Tamil, Latin, and illiterate, because Tamil doesn't have mirrored characters, right, to see whether there was any sort of crossover to the being able to avoid the mixing up of the mirroring. And what they claim is that if you learn to read, your orientation of reading will influence. So in fact, you don't have to be literate in Latin in order to be able to avoid that. But you have to be literate. Yeah, that's very confusing. Sorry, it's a good reason not to put it in, but it seems to go beyond a familiarity with that particular script. It seems to go with direction of reading, enables you to have some idea of which way things are facing.
Okay, thank you very much. Yep.
If I can mention this, we run this mini journal online. Can you say the sentence? How is it? It's on design for reading,
Yeah.
And research of reading. Those are typically short articles. So if you would like to contribute, we would very much appreciate that. So feel free to get in touch with Mary.
Thank you.